think we do have people from all over the world, what is really amazing. This is also one of the advantages, right? Having this sort of calls. We do have people from all over the world, what is really amazing. It's also one of the advantages, right? Having this sort of calls. We do have so live stream via YouTube is working. Good. And I would suggest that we are starting right now. Warmly welcome to all of you. We are really glad that so many of you are joining us today at our webinar, Data Journalism in Times of Corona. My name is Pauline Tillman. I'm project manager at DW Akademie, and this webinar is part of a project, of a cooperation project called Governance Media Innovation by DW Akademie and GIZ, the German Development Agency. And this project is funded by the BMZ, the German Ministry of Development Cooperation. We have about 60 minutes. In the beginning, we have inputs of each speakers of about 10 minutes. And afterwards, we will have approximately half an hour for Q&A. And if you do have any questions, please write them into the chat box, and we will discuss them after the two presentations. As mentioned in the chat box, we stream this webinar also via live, via YouTube. So this is also the place where you can find the recorded session afterwards. And now I would like to introduce our two keynote speakers. And this is firstly Gianna-Carina Grün, who is head of data journalism at Deutsche Welle. She will be talking about how to handle the so-called known unknown. She will give examples of how newsrooms are coping with the crisis internationally. And she will also talk about problems that can occur with data. Great having you, Gianna.
Thank you.
And our second speaker is Natalia Viana. She is co-founder and co-director of Agência Pública. It is a Brazilian media startup founded in 2011, focused on investigative journalism. So sometimes investigative journalism can be combined with data journalism, but of course not always. So the title of our webinar should be more correct: Data and Investigative Journalism in Times of Corona. But this was a bit too long. So Natalia will be talking about how the crisis and also the government in Brazil is handling the pandemic, how it affects her work as journalist, and what we can learn out of it. And now I would like to give the word to our first speaker, Gianna-Carina Grün, and this is your stage.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me today. I'm really looking forward to discussing with you later. But first, I would like to start by share a probably very subjective collection of examples of how the coronavirus coverage has evolved over the past month with special focus on data journalism, and then highlight a few ideas why the current situation is particularly special. So early on, everyone wanted to know where the disease was spreading and what the case numbers were in their particular country. And you probably all have seen this dashboard by the Johns Hopkins University, which was the most prominently used data source in the very beginning. And it later had some spin-offs, like this one example from the African Center for Disease Control that sort of regionalized the dashboard to reflect only the case numbers and deaths in African countries. And then one of the outlets to put out a series of data visualizations first was the Financial Times from the UK. And they wanted to show whether other European countries were on the same path down as Italy, which at the time was the European country with the highest case count. So it was to see, are we all on the same path same trajectory as Italy is. And sort of the next small evolutionary step was drilling down on granularity. Here is an example from Germany's Site Online or the Portuguese outlet Público, who both on a very granular regionalized level showed what case numbers were over time and allowed users to also explore the data themselves and look up their numbers for their particular region. And moving away from displaying only case counts and death counts, some data-driven pieces focused more on an explanatory note. For example, this very prominent example by the Washington Post, who simulated how the virus would spread over time if there were no social distancing measures in place, highlighting their importance. And similarly to that, also this piece by Vox.com showed like what this flatten the curve mantra that we've all heard probably meant, and visualizing the healthcare system capacity and context to case numbers, both explaining why looking at case numbers and keeping them low is important. And then adding up to those explanatory pieces, there were others going beyond case numbers and adding even more context. This is an example from the Mexican outlet Tucan, who visualized how many hospital beds and doctors there are per 1 million inhabitants. And making this like very abstract topic of healthcare system capacity much more relatable for users. And another example going beyond case numbers and adding more context to the current debate is probably this piece by the New York Times, who showed different worker groups' exposure to diseases and also the proximity to others, and especially their customers, to highlight what role we play and our system plays in spreading the disease further. And then you could see like these, I call them in times of corona charts popping up. So how have different factors, variables evolved over time. So there's this, on the left hand, you can see an example from the Spanish outlet Civio, who showed how pedestrian traffic increased during the lockdown. And on the right, you see how the Nigerian outlet The Fact visualized a trend of how food prices rose during the lockdown. And then moving on from these more explanatory and contextualizing pieces, you could see rather analytical articles coming up. This piece by the New York Times highlights the excess deaths. And it's only one example where the data itself does not tell the story, but rather the questions that the data leads you to ask. They could show how in 2020, many more people died across various US states, and not all of these excess deaths were attributed as coronavirus deaths, pointing very strongly at how patchy the data still is. And then another great example of a more analytical piece generating a deeper insight is this article by the Washington Post that showed how non-white people have a higher risk of dying from COVID than, and that the overall health risk is higher in those neighborhoods where people of color live. So really interlinking the corona data with additional data to generate a deeper insight. So taken together, I feel there's this evolution starting from pieces that are more explanatory, focused on case numbers, moving on to pieces that provide more context. And then you have these trend pieces that show how something evolved during the time of the pandemic or during the lockdown. And then ending up with pieces that are more analytical, that provide more context and deeper insights. And now you might say, well, isn't that true for all data journalism? And you would probably be right. I think there are still some things that are particularly different about the current situation. I would like to share 5 aspects that really stood out to me. So the first is that data journalism became much more visible and relevant. Like all of the major outlets, let it be the Washington Post, the Guardian, the Financial Times, they all reported how their data-related corona coverage had much more views and reactions than their other coverage. Which sort of makes a point about how in uncertain times, people seem to turn to data to inform themselves and to make sense of the current situation and form their opinion, which makes data journalism an even more, or data visualization, a more powerful tool, as it right now can like literally be about life and death. And so I think we as data journalists have an even greater responsibility to make considerate choices in our data storytelling process. And that's becoming even trickier right now because many more people from a wide range of backgrounds are working on this data. And it might be people who don't have a lot of experience working with data or on a science topic. So I'm very lucky. I'm trained both as a science and as a data journalist. So that makes me naturally aware of many of the fallacies, like the possible accuracy of numbers or how to evaluate a scientific study. But that is not the case for everybody who needs to deal with these numbers right now. So I think it's now more important than ever to question the data and question the science. And if you so far don't have a lot of experience with that, it's so important to team up with someone who has, right? I really like this example that Reuters did. They showed how much of the current scientific output on coronavirus had not gone through the normal quality control that is peer review. So all the yellow highlighted studies you see here have not been quality controlled how they would normally be. And given that science is sort of at the center of the current debate, so much more can go sideways and wrong if you're not aware of the things that you should watch out for. And I'm not saying that it's like a conscious choice that people make to ignore it. I think many of the journalists working on this topic might not be aware of what to look out for. And so that's how we are in this very volatile situations where there are so many things that we don't know yet. You know, some of you might maybe know the unknown knowns matrix. It's a concept to evaluate risks in a certain situation. So known knowns in the upper left here are facts. It's things that you are already aware of. Then as journalists, there are also things that you know you do not know. That's why you go ask experts about it. That would be the known unknowns. And then there are the unknown knowns in the upper right. That would be things that you are not aware of, you should think about, but your experts might point you in the right direction. And then the really juicy part is on the bottom right, the unknown unknowns, which is none of the actors involved in a certain topic is aware of this factor being relevant, right? And given that SARS-CoV-2 is so new, if you transfer it to this and assess what we know and what we don't know, we can say, okay, we know it's a virus, we know the symptoms, we know how it's transmitted. We maybe don't know all of the ways it's transmitted. But then on the unknown known side, there might be some risk factors that we are already aware of, but since it's an evolving situation, some scientists might know of more risk factors now than the entire scientific community, because it just takes time to generate enough evidence and to spread word about it. And then in the known unknowns, things we don't know is like, will there be a second wave? Will the virus mutate in a new strain? These are all factors that we cannot determine yet, right? And which is also say, as journalists, we try to find easy answers and easy explanations, and it's important to like drill down and make it understandable. But in this particular situation, I feel there's so much we don't know, or we actually know very, very little, and we should adjust our reporting very carefully and reflect that, like, what is that what we know for sure, and what is that all that what we don't know yet. And since this situation is pretty volatile, it's so important that we communicate correctly, right? That we communicate best guesses, and that is what we are dealing with here. I really like this example. It's by the German broadcaster RBB, who showed the evolution of the reproduction rate of the virus over time. So you can see the best guess, which is the dark blue line, right? And then you have the highest guess and the lowest guess in the light blue area also within the chart, to be like, okay, this is like the blue line, the value that we talk about and that we report on is what we think is the most credible information. But of course, there's variance, and we need to be sure that like this could still evolve. And you can also do that textually, right? Instead of saying down to the digit number, you could be like, there are more than X thousand cases, to account for the fact that you do not know exactly how many there are. And I think this is another important point, that you should dare to be imprecise in a way. So in the beginning, we saw a lot of like these very precise down to the digit case numbers. But if you're honest, then the nature of how these numbers are produced, you know that they inherently cannot be this precise, especially with regards to the shelf life of that number. By the time you have it on your page, it is likely to be outdated already. So it can pay off to be allegedly more imprecise. So you might have seen how many news outlets have chosen to show the rolling average instead of the precise case number. So on the middle chart here, you see the daily new cases reported in Germany, and you see like these ups and downs. And on the right chart, you see a rolling average over 7 days. And so, I mean, if you see an upward trend in the right chart, then you know a little more certain that there is an upward trend, and that it's not just a Monday where finally all the reported cases from the weekend are pulled through to the dashboard. And besides the uncertainty and the known unknowns, the current situation is also much more complex than other situations we currently operate in, because several factors are interconnected. And it's so tempting to like look at just one factor like lockdown measures and be like, okay, why did country A lock down later or opened earlier? And why did country B do that differently? But you actually cannot look at lockdown measures and just draw a conclusion from that. In order to make a considerate comparison, you have to make sure you're aware that all factors are interlinked. So usually we talk about case numbers and deaths, which actually should be a reported case number, reported deaths. The actual numbers are likely to be higher, and how high they are also depends on how they are reported, right? And then you have the unreported cases, people that might be asymptomatic and this never appear in the system. And then the deaths number, for example, is also influenced by how prepared your healthcare system is. So if you have a very good healthcare system that can take care of many sick patients, then your death case number might be lower, right? And then also the demographics of a country plays a role, and it goes on like that. And we were mentioning lockdown measures earlier. If you lock down, you might have less cases reported. If you have less cases reported, you might ease in your lockdown. Then if you test a lot, then you have higher case numbers. And then if you have higher case numbers, you also test a lot. So it's sort of the spiral and self-fulfilling circle. And then if you test a lot, it could also mean that you have lower death numbers because you catch many infected people early on. And then tracing comes into play. It's like if you are able to trace contacts well, you can administer tests much more targeted rather than testing in a very broad scale. Which is also say that, this will then play back into all these other factors. So what it comes down to is that it's like a very complicated situation, and it takes time and a lot of resources to depict it responsibly, both be aware of and make your users aware that you depict a best estimate that is based on imperfect data. That would be a first start from me, and I'm looking forward to your questions later on.
Thank you very much. Gianna, perhaps we can answer the questions right now, the 3 questions that occurred so far, before we go to Natalia and talk about investigative journalism in Brazil. There was one question, for example, do you have the analytics per chart type? It would be interesting to know what types are better working.
That's a really good question. Thank you for that. It's something where you cannot really find a general answer to. I think it highly depends on what your particular audience is already used to, right? If you look at the Financial Times chart, they were one of the first to introduce a logarithmic scale, because a virus also spreads exponentially. So it wouldn't be fair to do like just a linear scale. Also, because it would dwarf the relations between countries. So they made a very considerate choice. They earned a lot of criticism because people were like, yeah, but users are not used to read logarithmic charts. Then again, for the particular Financial Times audience, it's probably an audience that is accustomed to a wide variety and also more complex charts. So I think it's a very fair choice to make. And then again, if your users aren't used to particular chart types, so much more can go wrong and it can be misinterpreted. So I think it's like, you can also test it, right? So what we often do is like show it around in our newsroom and ask colleagues for input as like a first user feedback. And we also always make several iterations of a chart to then draw a conclusion from there, which of the versions we made conveys the message best. So I think it's really a trial and error and needs to be adjusted to your particular situation.
Okay, and one brief question more before we are coming to Natalia. Can you talk a bit about the impact that Corona has had in your newsroom? Have dynamics changed, and how, if at all, have structures or processes changed?
That's also an awesome question. So I can only talk for Deutsche Welle right now. The majority of us is in home office. Of course, people who do like more news-related, TV-related stuff have to be in the office because the studio is there. But a lot of us could move rather seamlessly to home office, which is, I think, a great experience because it makes working much more flexible. Processes, I feel like in a way communication has shifted. We introduced a new chat tool, a video conference tool, so that was seamlessly, and I feel that some of the conferences are more accessible and you talk more on eye level with one and another because you're all in like this digital meeting without any barriers to that.
In the same situation, in the same boat.
Yeah.
Some kind of. Yeah, okay. Good, thank you very much, Gianna. We will have time for Q&A after Natalia's presentation. So I would like to give the word to Natalia Viana, who is a well-known journalist in Brazil. And she is co-founder and co-director, as I mentioned, of Agência Pública, and she also prepared a short presentation, and I will give the word to you, Natalia. Great having you with us.
Thank you very much. Before I do my presentation, I just wanted to expand on something that Gianna talked about. She was talking about how it is important that journalists are experts in data or think about or know how to work with data, because otherwise you can convey information that is not true. And this, I think, is specifically important in contexts that are polarized societies such as Brazil, as I'm going to explain to you. Because if you convey a fact that is later dismissed, you actually help people who are working towards spreading fake news. And this is super important. So this is another reason why data journalists are so important, because they think about what they're doing carefully, and science journalists as well. So here's my presentation. I'm gonna, sorry. First I share. First I share my screen, and then I do. Is it working?
Yep, super.
Okay, so this is the newsroom of Agência Pública. We are an investigative nonprofit in Brazil, the first investigative journalism nonprofit in Brazil. It was founded in 2011. We're almost a decade old. It was founded by women, and it is directed by women, and we are also women. Majority of our staff are women, and we are all investigative journalists. Agência Pública works as an agency, so everything that we produce is shared for free with over 1,000 news outlets. We now publish mainly in Portuguese, of course, but also in Spanish and English. So last year, our articles have been published in over 18 countries in these 3 languages. And over the course of this decade, we have become the most awarded news agency in Brazil due to our investigative reporting. What do we investigate? Our main topic is human rights violations. Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world, and there is plenty of issues to report on. And then more specifically, we look into the public administration. We look into social and environmental impacts of corporations, the problems and failures of Brazilian justice system, and also violence. Brazil is also a very violent country against vulnerable populations, both in the cities where the majority of people live, but also in rural areas and in the Amazon. Now, how has coronavirus affected us, which was one of the questions. I have a little story to tell. Since the beginning of the year, from January, our team was very excited because we had spent weeks, actually 2 months, refurbishing our offices. And for the first time, we would have a workstation for every employee. We would have new computers, we had lighting, we don't have plugs for everybody for the first time in 10 years. And we had just finished the hiring process, so we would have like a completely new office and a completely new team. And then, the crisis hit in 16th of March, 3 months now. And of course, we never got to be back to the office, and we never had our little happy hour we were going to have to celebrate. So things changed quite dramatically overnight. We have decided that everybody should work from home. We knew that in Brazil, the crisis was going to hit very fast because of agglomeration, because of the favelas, the slums where lots of people live together, also because the country is so huge and huge inequality and the poverty. So we decided everybody should stay at home. We are communicating online a lot. We're communicating via Signal. It's a great tool. I suggest you use it because it's completely encrypted, very safe, very secure, and also the messages don't keep stored anywhere. So if you deal with sensitive information as we do, it's a very good tool. And we have weekly meetings, and of course, editor to reporter meetings almost daily. Some reporters still have to go out to cover stories because what we do a lot of shoe leather journalism. That was our main thing, but we had to cut down on this. But some reporters still needed to go. They need to go to the slums. They need to go to talk to people who are being affected. So they're taking precautions. We're following the guidelines of the Brazilian Investigative Journalism Association, using masks, trying to social distancing as much as possible. Funnily enough, working from home, we've doubled the production. We're producing much more. The site also has been having many more visitors. We're 140% more unique users since the beginning of the crisis. But of course, we had to scale down on travels. In Brazil, we travel a lot because it's a huge country. We travel a lot to the Amazon. So that has had a huge impact on real field report. What have we done? We decided, well, we knew that we needed to cover the reality of one of the most unequal countries in the world. And I'm going to explain to you very briefly the way that I think it's similar in many countries, but because Brazil is so divided, the way that coronavirus arrived in Brazil was first through the rich classes. They came from Europe, they were coming from the US, and then they arrived in Brazil and it started spreading to the lower classes, especially people who were working, like domestic workers who were working in these people's houses. And then they went back to their favelas where there is a huge agglomeration, and then it started spreading. There is a specific story that we did on how the social dynamics play the role there. We focused our coverage, therefore, on the poorer classes, workers, indigenous peoples, and rural communities. We've also ramped up a lot our data journalism work because we cannot do as much shoe leather reporting, so we're doing a lot of data journalism as well. We are looking at the numbers of intensive care units in different parts of Brazil, comparing them, trying to see how preparedness, how different states are prepared. Underestimation of data. The government is not really publishing all the data that is relevant. There is very little testing in Brazil if you compare to the US, for instance, which is a comparable situation. So the figures in Brazil are super overestimated. And then we are also looking at government expenses. We found the government spending a lot on advertisement, trying to overturn the bad image that it's getting for horrible management of the crisis, of which I'm going to talk in a little while. We're also looking at groups that are trying to profit and lobbying to take advantage of the situation. One of them is the religious groups, specifically the evangelical churches, which in Brazil have a huge political influence. They have politicians, they have parties, they are very politically influential. Here are some of the stories. These are the typical stories we would do that we continue doing. So, for instance, this shows that in the state of Mato Grosso, which is the agribusiness center of Brazil, the indigenous communities are being affected because of the slaughterhouses. So first, the disease started spreading in the slaughterhouses. Slaughterhouses have not shut down. And then some Indians worked there, and then they have been going back to their tribes and spreading it in their tribes. And of course, indigenous need special, care because of ethnicity, but also many of these indigenous, specifically in the state, Mato Grosso, live under poverty conditions and in agglomerations because they do not have enough land. So this is a very big problem This is a data story that is very interesting because we managed to track the number of colored people, Black people who were getting more and more affected and contaminated, and we could see that the number of Black people that were getting affected jumped 5 times. So this was the moment in which the pandemic became really really Brazilian, like it started spreading in Brazil. And the moment it started spreading in Brazil, the rich people, middle class people could self-isolate, and the people who lived in slums cannot. So again, it's right now at this moment affecting people of color, Black people, much more, like 5 times more than white people. And this is based on data. We could prove that. This is a story that we did. This is it's not shoe leather, it's foam leathering reporting, showing how the evangelical churches were lobbying and are still lobbying for 2 things. First, they did not want to be closed, and they managed that. The president decided that evangelical churches was an essential service, so they could continue to be open during the crisis. And of course, this is a huge problem because you have agglomeration. But also they are lobbying for, you know, government support and loans from the government, because the way they work is that they request payment from the religious, from the people who go to the church. And of course, because people are not going as much to church, their revenue has gone down a lot. So they're lobbying for money from the government. Now, what is important, what is relevant in Brazil is that we are not only covering the health crisis, we are covering a humongous political crisis that I've never seen in my life. And because we have to cover the worst president in the world, and I can say that because the Washington Post elected President Bolsonaro the worst president in the world, as how he's dealing with the crisis. This is written in Portuguese, so I'm going to go to the stories first. The president of Brazil, he has downplayed the coronavirus, but unlike Trump, he didn't change his moods. He's still downplaying it. He's going out, he's shaking the hands of protesters. He is claiming, he's talking against isolation all the time. Now the numbers are going up. He has fired his Minister of Health, who was pro-isolation. And he has really pushed his supporters to go out and do protests, protests with cars, in their cars, causing agglomeration, going out and shaking their hands. So he's conveying the story that the whole coronavirus crisis is fabricated or overestimated. And this has, over the months, had an impact in the public opinion. So Brazil has never managed to have a very big number of isolation because the president is working against it. People who are really supporting it are the governors, because they're the ones who, you know, have to deal with the health crisis in their regions. So it is a complete fiasco. There is a huge crisis, and right now the president is threatening to use the military to intervene. It's really, I've never seen it so bad. We can talk about this a little bit more later. But what is interesting in terms of reporting is that apart from doing like the reporting that we used to do, we are doing a completely different type of reporting, which is looking at social media, doing a complete online investigation, trying to track down how government supporters are spreading fake news, how they are using robots to spread the fake news about the virus, and how they are paying agencies to spread the fake news about the virus. And something that I believe, maybe not now, but in the future, will be considered a crime, because it has had, it has led to more deaths, this kind of arrangement. So this is one of the stories. This is how his closest allies mounted a huge network of people who are influencers, and specifically on Twitter and Facebook, who are spreading fake news, absolute fake news about the virus and about the figures being, they're saying that the numbers are not correct. They're right now this week asking for people to invade hospitals and film hospitals to show that they are empty, which is a lie. But of course, there are parts of the hospitals they are not full because they are not part of the hospital that are receiving the corona patients. So now there is a bunch of right-wing crazy people going into hospitals and filming them, and the president himself has requested them to do this. And this is also another article showing how the people who are in the network of support of the president, they were working towards founding a new party. They are the ones leading this huge fake news propaganda campaign, which is basically, you know, it's as if like your worst nightmares, all the conspiracy theories you see online and you laugh off are seated in the presidency. This is what's happening in Brazil. So we are looking at the networks, we are looking at the relationships, and more, not only us, but other media in Brazil, but we are doing this. We're looking at the money, we're looking at the funding. Who is funding these people? Who is funding this fake news? What are the agencies that are working on it? And how much of this money is public money? Because of course, that is a crime. That's it for now. We can discuss a little bit more later. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia, for the best practice examples. And the question in the announcement was also, what did you learn out of the pandemic? I'm not sure if you mentioned that, but perhaps you can just briefly answer, like, what did you personally learn within the past 3 months?
Well, I first of all, I liked your presence better because it's really bad to have a huge crisis with a very, you know, with a person who's not capable of dealing with it. What I think in terms of organization we learned is that it is absolutely possible to cover and to have a completely functional organization working online. But really, I think for now, what we are seeing is the utter power of fake news and the effect that it can have on the lives of people. And I think, well, I had been to Venezuela and I'd seen it at work, but it's happening in Brazil, it's happening in the US, a little bit less, but you see how it's extreme, like how the battlefield is exactly journalism and it's exactly information. And if you have a network of people spreading misinformation, it can have serious effects on the population. I think this is what I'm taking right now from the current crisis in Brazil.
And Mehmet is asking, do you have the impression that data and visualization journalism is having an impact on the people who elected Bolsonaro?
Yes, data journalism has. The thing is, people are also looking more to the media. The media is doing their best. Both, you know, small media startups, big media, they're doing their best. And I do think that data journalism and charts help a lot to convey. As I said, we never managed to have less than 50%, to have more than 50% social isolation, but we only did it because the governors are doing their work and the media is doing their work. So people are receiving this information, because that at the same time they're receiving information from the top government that is the contrary. So I don't think it's their fault. You have two different lines of arguments side by side. So it is confusing, and it is confusing everywhere. Imagine if you have everybody's confused and now you have two different lines of argument conflicting.
I would like to take Gianna back on board. So yeah, there were some questions in the chat box that occurred. For example, there was a question if there are numbers, how many journalists have been affected by COVID, and Gianna already mentioned that in the chat box. There are 5 questions by Cornelius. I would ask you to ask one question if this is possible, because there are so many other questions. And there were also questions, for example, by 15 dedicated young data journalists who are joining a data fellowship at DW Akademie, and some of them sent us questions previously. And I would like to ask Gianna one of them. For example, one of the data fellows wanted to know, do you have 3 top tips for data journalism in times of COVID-19?
Yeah, like I said earlier, one of them would maybe be like, if you are not a data journalist already, I think this is a good time to get into it and find someone who can like mentor you. Then if you are a data journalist already and you brainstorm story ideas, I think what is important right now as we've progressed into the pandemic to think about how you can add value to our reporting. You don't need like the 7th replication of how the case numbers are in country X, but really think of how you and for your outlet can generate new insights. And the 3rd tip, I don't know, 2 are maybe even better, right? You don't have to choose.
There's a question concerning the Brazilian government. Natalia, I don't know if you see it in the chat box. There's a question, have journalists in Brazil been threatened by government officials when they're reporting about COVID-19? And the other question is, does your government make an artificial boundary to journalists who write about COVID-19? So is there some kind of separation between these people who are telling the truth and these people who are, you know, making some kind of propaganda for the government?
There is, but mainly, I mean, for the first time, I think yesterday, there was an investigation launched, but against a cartoonist that, you know, just did a cartoon against Bolsonaro. But what they are doing is they're using social media to discredit and attack journalists. So it hasn't been so far like a legal initiatives, but there is a lot of slander, there's a lot of defamation going on, and this is daily. Daily or every week, the president has his live talk on social media, on Facebook, and then he just gets whatever journalist is getting attention for reporting on Corona or on the government, and then, you know, they just you know, defame them and try to totally you know, take out the prestige of that journalist. And this is daily, this is happening all the time. And even though it's not like a legal stance, it does create a lot of confusion in the minds of people, and of course it affects the reputation of the journalists, which is so relevant for what we do.
And would you say that investigative research is easier or the opposite, more difficult, when reporters have to work remotely?
It's more difficult because there is, you know, sensitive information is better conveyed in person and documents, etc. However, as I said, and Jenna will be happy, as I said, but I'm going to say again, it has given us the opportunity to develop data journalism much more, because we have to. That's what we have to work on. So I think we've done things that we wouldn't be doing otherwise, and I'm very glad that we are learning a lot with this opportunity as well.
So we flip to Gianna and back to Natalia. One question after another. There was a question by Ivan in the chat box where we can find resources to learn more about data journalism. Are there valuable resources that you can share with us, Gianna?
There are so many. It's probably the broadest question. It really depends on where you're at. Like if you have any previous experience or you're hearing about it now, there's a great resource that's been updated last year. It's called the Data Journalism Handbook. I can find a link in a second. And I think that is a great place to start from, to get an idea, because it has many, like it explains the theory behind it, and it has many examples and also some steps where to go next. I think I would point you for a starting point there.
Okay. And as we all know, the need for information is huge, and many media outlets worldwide doubled their reach of online users. Natalia, you mentioned that you reached 140% more online users in the past 3 months. Gianna, would you say that data journalism is part of the answer out of the crisis? of legacy media houses, you know, who have in general less and less readers with their printed version?
Yeah, I think it can be. I'm not so much like media type agnostic. I think it's all about storytelling, and I do believe that maybe the form or the medium we convey the story with needs to adjust more to the needs of our users, right? So I wouldn't really make it a print TV online discussion, but what I like about the question is like this, I mean, we're not only in a business model crisis, we are also in a trust crisis, right? But that's a very subjective observation that I feel, given that so much more people look at our coverage right now, I feel this trust is coming back. I think, or I hope maybe people have seen the value in journalism more, right? I mean, Natalia, you earlier said that also people who elect Bolsonaro look at the coverage and also at the data journalism part. And I think what we often find ourselves in like this preaching to the choir, like we talk and report to people who are already of the same beliefs as we are, right? And the big question is, how do we reach those who are not in our bubble, who think something completely differently? And so that's why the increase in more readers made me very optimistic, because somewhere these people need to come from. And if more people now see the value in journalism and in reporting and in fact-based reporting, I think that can be a chance. But yeah, it also means we have to work on, you know, transparency. And I mean, we publish all the data and code behind our analysis, but we could be even more progressive about it and explain more the story behind our stories, how we reach certain points. And I think it can be a good chance. The question is whether we'll use it well.
There was a misunderstanding. I did not mention the doubling rate of COVID cases, but the doubling of reaching online users. So that online platforms, digital magazines, for example, they reach right now double audience rates. This is what I mentioned. So this was a misunderstanding. And there's a question to Natalia. What if local media supports the government to make fake news about COVID-19 data? What did you in this case?
This is a very interesting question. The fact is, because local governments are the ones that have to deal with the crisis, there may be one or two that are, trying to go by the government because of political favors or something, but most of them are not, because the virus will not care if there is fake news or not. The virus will just spread. And if you're telling the people that it doesn't exist, that it's not as bad, and they should be out, and there should not be social isolation, it's going to spread, and there's going to be more deaths, and there is no escape from that. So from the beginning, even this health minister who was fired, he said, we cannot pretend this is not a huge crisis, because it will come and bite us back. And this is what's happening. So I guess the reality factors is what's making the local governments stick to, science, because it's unavoidable. They're going to be the first ones not to be elected next time.
Mm-hmm. Cornelius, I just wanted to mention that you can ask questions. Of course, you just ask 5 of them. So if you would focus on one question, we would be glad to answer to that. And there was a question to Gianna. Wait a minute. Has the increased visibility and relevance of data for the public discourse also translated into your newsroom? Is there more interest in popularity of data journalism internally, and have collaborations with editors and reporters changed compared to before COVID-19? So there are also 3 questions in one, but perhaps you can answer to some of them.
Okay. Yeah, thanks for the question. It hasn't changed as much as I would have liked to. If you look at the particular coverage that my team did, we didn't do many stories. One of the reasons is that we are a very small team compared to all the other teams out there. So it's really challenging for us to come up with something that would be unique and we would be able to compete with. We are working on stories, and the ones that we do collaborate on, we have a tighter collaboration with beat reporters or other editorial teams. However, I wouldn't say that it's due to Corona. I think it's just due to the fact that we are around longer and we form these bonds over time. The visibility and relevance definitely has increased, I feel. There are much more people using data in our newsroom. However, like we are equivalent of 2.5 full-time positions, and we have 3,000 employees at Deutsche Welle, so we are not able to help all of them. I think that is an important part. But if you look at like interviews of data journalists and other newsrooms, you definitely see what you have, that there is more internal interest in data journalism and people sort of get data journalism rather, although we would probably also differ between, you know, journalism with numbers and being more descriptive, and really move more to Natalia's investigative side, which is, I think, something that most data journalists are particularly interested on, like not just showing the numbers as is, but gaining insights from it.
Mm-hmm. There's a question to Natalia. How are you coping with on-the-ground reporting in these times when social contact is limited? You already mentioned that it's more difficult to do investigative stories in remote times, but perhaps you can make it a little bit more specific.
We're doing it specifically about victims. We were, for instance, reporting on the crisis on prisons, which is really bad. And, you know, some of our reporters have had to go and talk to people who are just freed from prison. So, you know, it's social. It's like when you go to a supermarket, you have to wear the mask, you have to have to clean your hands. You have to be in an outside setting, far away from the person. But it is doable, not forever. But everybody understands it's a crisis situation. But I would love to answer the other question, if I may, which is, what do you do in countries where there is not a lot of data, where there is no transparency? And one of the things that we are about to launch. So in Brazil, there's not a lot of testing. You only get tested if you go to the hospital and your situation is serious. So people, they think the numbers are about 10 times as high as the numbers that are being reported. And we've decided that we want these stories. This is one factor. The other factor is that people who have not been tested are dying, and their deaths certificates come out as indeterminate causes. So we know that there is much more people dying of COVID than there's being reported. So we've decided to launch engagement reporting initiative in Agência Pública, something that the US investigative newsrooms such as ProPublica do a lot. We're going to launch a questionnaire, a series of different questionnaires asking people to tell us their stories. And we're right now working on establishing a network of community organizations that can help spread the word, so people will report back to us. This cannot be seen as like an accurate data. Specifically, we're not going to know the total of cases, but we're going to know, out of the people who responded to us, what kind of situations they're facing. So this is one of the ways that we're trying to circumvent the lack of available data.
And do you think, Natalia, that journalism as a whole will be different in Brazil after the pandemic is gone? So could you make a concrete example? So what will be different afterwards?
I think absolutely. I agree with Gianna in that people are relying more on journalism. At least people are seeing that journalism has something to offer. Mm-hmm. And, you know, the media does, even though, so the attacks, which I see as a generational thing. I don't see it as, I think it's the younger generations, they don't trust the media. Also, you know, newspapers are gone. So there is a lot of confusion of where to get your information, but I think they're more and more looking at journalism. But I also think that collaboration has become a mainstream thing, a huge thing. One of the things that happened here in Brazil is that because the government, two weeks ago, the government decided not to publish the deaths that did not happen in the last 24 hours. So if somebody died on Tuesday and the test only comes out on Friday, saying that that death was caused by Corona, that's not going to be reported, which is completely absurd. But this is happening in Brazil. So a team of the biggest newspapers in Brazil, mainstream newspapers, got together, and they are getting the data from different sources, specifically from regional governments, and they are publishing the data daily. And it's a different data than the government. This is unprecedented. I do think that collaboration is something that will remain much after the Corona crisis. And also, unfortunately, I think many newsrooms will move to totally virtual because it's cheaper and it works. We've seen it works.
Okay. So we are coming slowly to the end. There are 5-6 minutes left. There are so many questions in the chat box that we should answer to. One is for you, Gianna. Could you name some really data investigative stories on COVID you analyzed? It will be very useful for some trainers and journalists. As I mentioned, there's data journalism and there's investigative journalism. Sometimes it can be combined. Perhaps you do know examples that you can share with us.
I just shared one in the chat, but I'm not sure whether everybody can see it. Not
we can see it
using Zoom. But anyway,
Washington Post.
It's one of the examples I mentioned. It's nothing we did, but someone else did, and I feel like these pieces are just about to come. I don't think there are many out there yet. I feel like only now journalists sort of have the time to like take a step back and go away from breaking news reporting and move more towards analytical and longer term pieces. So I think we will be seeing much more of this in the next months.
Okay, and Basil is asking how you can be sure that there's no government interference when investigative the data available. To Natalia.
Yes, how do you know the government?
There's no government interference when you're investigating data, or well, when data is available.
If the official data are not tampered with.
Yeah.
Well, actually, you know, if you have experts on data and you keep asking questions about how this data is produced, it's not that hard to find out where there is an issue. So I'm not sure it was clear. I'm going to explain again. Every day, all over the world, all countries publish the results of the deaths that are coming in. This includes deaths in the last 24 hours, but this also includes deaths in the last week whose results only came in that day. Now, the supporters of the government were saying this is unfair because that's not really the deaths that happened in the last 24 hours. So, you know, this is a nuance with data. But the problem is if you don't count the deaths, the results that are only coming in at that date, you're going to have figures that not represent reality of the total of cases. This has become a huge debate. But I think in the end, the government decided to backtrack on this decision because it was a very, you know, irrational decision. But he was asking questions. He was asking questions and always like showing rationally with, you know, data, with charts and etc. that this is just wrong. This is going to mean that deaf people would disappear from the official count.
Mm-hmm. There's also this question by Cornelius, for example, perhaps to you, Gianna, regarding the data. What are the main sources of data collection? How do you account for accuracy? So this is also to this point, that the data is reliable.
Yeah, like Natalia just mentioned, I think the questioning the data is super crucial. Regarding the data sources, the Johns Hopkins University dashboard is still one of the biggest compilers, and then many newsrooms, at least the ones that I've seen across Europe, have shifted towards the ECDC, the European Center for Disease Control, who also do compilation. They have like a different way of how they publish the data and what, like not in what format, but how the data is structured and at what point in time it's updated. And if you have like a live updating chart on your page, that's relevant to you. The last time I checked, which is probably 1 or 2 months ago, is that the difference between those two data sources isn't that big. How do you account for accuracy? Well, you are hopefully aware that the data isn't accurate, like you always take it with a grain of salt, and then you do what Natalia said, you ask a lot of questions. Like if you see spikes or inconsistencies, your first prompt should not be, oh, this is an interesting development in this particular country, but your first instinct should be, could this be because the data is gathered differently? Could it be because there is an inconsistency? Could it be because of a tech problem? Like make first sure that there is no sort of technical reason why you see a certain trend before you then go into like if you check that, then you can think about why you see the certain trend, if that proved not to be a technical problem.
Okay, so 60 minutes are almost over. There was also a very general question in the very beginning, for example, due to this pandemic situation, what impacts are occurring in this modern world? This is probably something that we can discuss about another half an hour. But I would ask you, like, the last question from my side. Is there anything you would like to remain after the crisis? So, for example, more flexibility, more home office, less traveling, less flights. Perhaps, Natalia, can you name something that you would like to remain after COVID-19 is gone?
Yeah, I think more flexibility will have to happen, and it's good because it also includes more collaboration and more trust in the team. And I think we've become a team that is much more connected. There's much more trustworthy and reliable and relying on each other than when we needed to be in the office to prove that. So I really hope that this collaborative spirit continues.
Okay, and Gianna?
Yeah, I would pick up on that. You also mentioned that earlier, Natalia, that being in home office in this current situation made you think more about data journalism story ideas, and that would be great if, like, you could spread that word around. I think, yeah, but I mean, that's me being idealistic about my own profession, right? That I think it's a great way to do storytelling. And preparing for this talk, I read this nice sentence that the best stories are generated if you marry data and narrative writing. And I think that's a really good way to go about it. And I would like to see more of that, because I think this situation we're in right now is the perfect opportunity to push for it.
Wow, this is a perfect final statement. Thank you very much, Natalia Viana to Brazil. Thank you very much, Gianna Grün to Berlin. These were really useful insights, I think. Thank you also to my colleague Hannah for the technical support in the background, and thank you to Bahia, who initiated this webinar. Thank you for the questions and for discussing so lively with us on this really relevant topic. And as I mentioned, we will upload the session on YouTube, so feel free to share it with people who might be interested. And at DW Academy, we hope that all of you are growing with the recent challenges and publish even more quality content or establish new innovative projects which help to meet the need of your audience, or even better, to find new audiences. And yeah, I just would like to say thank you very much. Take care and goodbye. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Thank you, Gianna. Thank you, Natalia, and all the best.